Thank you. Thank you, Martin, for this nice presentation. It's sometimes I ask me if I am the person we are talking about. And thank you, everybody, to be here, and thank you also to the director of the cluster for the kind invitation. So I just modified a little the title of my paper. In principle, I gave the Dictionary of Dependencies in the Roman Empire some remarks, but at the end I decided to focus this paper on the first part of the Roman experience, so the archaic system, in order to present the first problems that we have with sources. But as I told you, I am very pleased to be here in Bonn and to have the opportunity to give this paper in a cycle of conferences dedicated to the memory of Joseph Miller. This scholar allowed us to put to system the numerous and disarticulated informations about the phenomena of asymmetrical dependency, mainly those concerning the experiences on the second millennium of the current era. In 2012, Miller published, and it was quite a scientific testament, an important book, The Problem of Slavery as History, a Global Approach, in which he shed new light on the very nature of slavery, arguing that it must be viewed generally as a social process rather than as an institution. Tracing the global history of slaving over thousands of years, Miller revealed in this book the shortcomings of Western narratives that define slavery by the same structures and power relations regardless of places and times, concluding instead that slaving is a process which can be understood fully only as embedded in changing circumstances. This book was a huge inspiration to me. The approach of Miller was in fact very close to my Weltanschauung. As historian and jurist, I have ever seen the history of legal phenomena not only as an history of words and ideas, but as a history of categories that we could define as categories in progress due to the evolution of societies. But obviously, in the examination of this process of evolution, it is also necessary to pay attention to the semantics of law and to the evolution of the words and ideas underlying these semantics. In this sense, I absolutely agree with the consideration of Miller that a reconsideration of the key concepts, terminologies and categories structuring the way of a society and the way a society think and speak can establish a new language of analysis of the social phenomena. Reading Miller confirmed my suggestion that this perspective is not only right, but also a prominent, valuable tool for understanding the evolution of asymmetric dependencies. On this premise, clearly emerges the centrality of the study of society and law of ancient Rome, in order to reflect on some forms of asymmetrical dependencies and their evolution, also in pre-modern and modern societies. This topic was clearly already in the perspective of William Warwick Buckland, a distinguished scholar in Roman law and Regius Professor of Civil Law at the University of Cambridge between 1914 and 1946. In 1908, he published a monumental book about the Roman law of slavery, where already in the preface he pointed out that slavery was the most characteristic part of the most characteristic intellectual product of Rome. The intellectual product is obviously the law, with the consequence that it conditioned the relevant part of the ancient, pre-modern and modern debates descending by and connected with this product. In the same perspective, another scholar, as Moses Finlay, who also worked during his scientific life on paths between ancient history, law and economics, tried to point out how and how much not only Roman but also Greek experience in slavery conditioned some late debates on this phenomenon. In Ancient Slavery and Modern Ideology, published in 1979, he questioned on the connection between the experiences of the classical past and some modern slavery systems. Finlay mainly considered how the ancient slave societies came into being and how they were transformed in the long process that brought about medieval feudalism. how slavery functioned within the ancient economy and in ancient political systems, and how it was judged socially and morally. Another aspect questioned by Finlay was what modern historians have made of ancient slavery and why. A question for which he had no definitive answer, but for which he stressed some relevant questions. In other words, we could summarize these questions in this way. I will try to approach some examples that move Finlay's reflection. An understanding of Greek and Roman slavery is important for several cultural and historical reasons. First of all, scholars interested in the culture of classical world, in other words, ancient Greece and Rome, need to understand its system of slavery, one of its central institutions. In classical literature, for example, we found slaves everywhere. Their presence is often obvious. Achilles and Agamemnon quarrel over captive slave women in Homer's Iliad. Near the beginning of Aristotle's Politics, we find an infamous doctrine of natural slavery. Witty shaming slaves often drive the action of Roman comedies, and we speak about this topic later, and powerful ex-slave administrators play a large role in Tacitus' annals in the history of the reign of the Emperor Claudius. Less obviously, slavery permeated the Greek and Roman thinking, as evidenced by their frequent use of analogies to slavery. I am thinking, for example, of Cicero's famous assumption that we are all servants of the law in order to be free. Legum denique id circo omnes servis humus ut liberi esse possimus. This is almost a brochard that has immense repercussions on the field of the relationship between free men and law, and on the perception of the legal order in the thought of the late Roman Republic. This assumption reconducts all of us again to the consideration of background. The slavery is the most characteristic part of the most characteristic intellectual product of Rome. And it could be the subject of another paper, but it's enough for the moment. Second point stressed by Finlay was that classical slavery has had profound effects on modern slave societies, not just in the American South, but also in Brazil, Caribbean, and elsewhere. From the 17th through the 19th century, the studies of the classics played a huge role in Western education, and so Greek and Roman models were constantly present in the minds of slaveholders in the New World. They were deeply influenced, for example, by the Roman law of slavery. George Fitzhugh, I believe in Cesare Lombroso, in his infamous defense of slavery in the U.S. South, with this book, A Sociology for the South, drew on Aristotle's doctrine of natural slavery in order to justify slavery based on race. Classical models often shaped the way that modern slaveholders conceived of and justified slavery. About the same time, the American doctor Samuel Cartwright developed the theory of drapetomania, that is, of the sad and discontented attitude of the slave who meditates to escape. In this regard, Cartwright referred to the figure of the so-called sad servant, servus melancholicus, with which the Roman jurists variously dealt, and some description made by the philosopher Seneca. These statements by Seneca are moreover deliberately misunderstood by Cartwright, as Seneca legitimized that slaves' resentment were right in order to condemn the master's cruelty, understood as a manifestation of anger, ira in Latin. Then, not forgetting that classical styles, ideas, and values played an important role in Western culture in general, we can assume that understanding the role of slavery in ancient Greece and Rome can yield insight into ideas and debates important to the modern period. A typical example is the Code Noir, which is a collection of norms issued by Louis XIV of France to regulate the life of black slaves in the French colonies. As Alan Watson recently pointed out, the Code Noir incorporated the Roman law of slavery wherever applicable. For example, it preserved the Roman legal procedure of nocturnal surrender. If Titius' slave ruined Caius' property, Titius could either pay damages or surrender his slave to Caius. Despite its name and its topic, slavery, the Code Noir was rarely racist. In particular, manumitted slaves became colonial subjects of France with similar rights to what whites possessed, and this is the theory of slavery of Roman law. This policy was out of line with the prevalent racism, but French jurists followed the Roman lawyers, originally designed to regulate a non-racist and more open system of slavery. In light of the suggestions that I have just touched, and that have shown how Roman law has a series of implications that allow us to reconstruct not only the dynamics on the forms of asymmetric dependencies in the ancient Euro-Mediterranean world, but also to investigate the influence that Roman theory and practice of these forms of asymmetric dependencies have determined on subsequent experiences, now I will try to point out some remarks on specific aspects of such a research field. In particular, I will try to develop some findings on the terminology used in the archaic age of Rome to indicate the phenomena of asymmetric dependencies and its evolution, their evolution, showing how the legal practice led to the construction of concepts that formed the basis of the subsequent reflection of jurists on the geometries of dependencies. The origin of this path of research dates back to the first steps of my career, when in 2008 I worked on the drafting of about 15 entries for the underwater book Fior Antiche Sclaverai in Mainz, then published in 2017. In particular, working on the entry Famulus, I could realize and appreciate the evolution of this word. It's a word of Oscan origin. Oscan is an Italic pre-Roman language, and we can read, the origin of word famulus come from the Oscan people. They used to call the slave famel. From this term come also familia. This word was used since the archaic era to indicate the servants and person subject to a man with full rights, a pater. But the term also occurs in the poetic lexicon of the classical age. For example, the poet Virgil, in the Aeneid, qualified as famulus not only a slave in strict sense, but also free men who provided a form of service employed by another free man. Also, the term familia, as we have seen, derives from famulus. Familia indicates not only the heirs of a pater, father, but also all of his slaves. All of them, fili and famuli, had in common that they were in the service of a father-master. In other words, fili and famuli, as members of the familia, were subordinate to the most incisive power of the pater, the potestas, the patria potestas, for the fili, which included the right of life and death over every subordinate. Some of these subordinates, the fili, were obviously free people. In the sources, they are also indicated as free, liberi, in the sense that they would have enjoyed all political rights, and at the death of the pater they would have become patres themselves. Other subordinates, which for the moment we will generally qualify as slaves, were not free in the sense that they have no political rights, and upon the death of the pater they would enter in the potestas of his heirs. This perception can also be found in a 3rd century jurist, Domitius Ulpianus, who observed, all who are in servitude are embraced in the term familia, household I have translated, not only free men who are serving in good faith as slaves, but also the slaves of others. Those persons who are under the control of the purchaser, we understand also to be included in this definition. But let's go back to the word famulus. With this polysemic term, the Roman language indicated, for example, reading Cicero or in the poet Ovid, regardless of their condition as free men or slaves, also the priests, famulus sacrorum, and even animals devoted to deities, or even the minor deities at the service of the major ones. This last field, which we could define devotional, came to an end with the Christianization of the Roman Empire, when professing to be a servant of good began to appear a title of pride, and in the epigraphic and the literary documentation we find formulas such as famulus or famula Domini Jesu Christi and others like it. However, it's not clear if in this context the term famulus was a mere ritual term or if it indicated, at least for certain periods, particular social or religious functions. It is relevant to note that still today, in the Latin spoken as official language by the Vatican City, Famulus Dei is the title conferred to some popes or also to privates that distinguished themselves by holiness of life. The complex semantic stratification of a word like famulus shows quite clearly to everybody that the evolution of the phenomenon of asymmetric dependencies in the Roman world and the contamination exerted by the slave master model are very relevant for a research on asymmetrical dependencies. But a word as famulus doesn't complete the dictionary of Roman slavery, especially with regard to the archaic period of the Roman history, a period in which numerous forms of semi-servile asymmetric dependencies are documented, each with its own terminology that reflects an autonomous legal status. In the archaic period, the slaves were never qualified as servi. The common word was mancipium. This term is connected with the institute of mancipatio, which was the typical tool for the transfer of rights by a paterfamilias to another one already in the archaic law. In the norms attributed to the law of 12 tables were the first attempt of a codification of norms regulating the legal aspects of the Roman society in the 5th century before Christ. So, in the 12 tables, there are too many references to mancipia in the meaning of slaves to not admit that this term was very common in order to indicate slaves. Mancipatio was also very common in the last monarchical phase and in the early republican age, as we can assume reading the historian Titus Livius. But as everything suggests, between the 4th and 3rd centuries before Christ, a process of strong transformation of socio-economic role intervened in Rome, accentuating the cold legal datum of the ownership of a man by another man. This process was already completed in the season of modernization of Roman society, which coincided with the period of the first 2 Punic Wars. We are in the 3rd century. Only in this period, the main distinction between freemen and slaves became a stable point of reference, consisting of a constant on which the jurisprudence founded a whole part of its institution. A jurist as Gaius will speak later about a summa divisio de iura personarum, it's the source number 5. But the clear statement of Gaius was the arrival point of a process that deepened over time and made clear the distance between free and slaves in a period of circa 5 centuries. But But in this initial phase of the history of Rome, before Rome became a Mediterranean political and economic power, that is, from its origins to the 3rd century before Christ, the economy focused on the exploitation of the land. The forms of asymmetric dependence were then identifiable in a plurality of figures subjected to the pater familias in connection with the agricultural exploitation of the land. In archaic law, then, the abyss between freemen and slaves had been somewhat filled by a series of intermediate situations destined to disappear over time. The first, certainly older than the 12 tables, was the almost servile subordination of a filius left by the pater to another pater. The 12 tables speak precisely in this regard of a sale, a venditio. This was not to be an exceptional situation in an age in which the margins of accumulation still had to be very low, especially in an economy of small and very small farmers who could easily be cornered by some bad vintage. Hence, the need to find the resources necessary for survival by any means. The sale of children was certainly not an exclusive practice of the Romans, spread in different forms in many human societies. However, in the Roman case, the enslavement of free men was excluded. On this point, the autonomy of the family clashed with the strength of the city. The city couldn't lose its staff of citizens, of young citizens, without thereby endangering its very existence. For this reason, the son in mancipio was indeed in a slave condition in causa mancipi, as the jurists will write some centuries later, but neither had he lost his citizenship, nor had he been definitely removed from the potestas of the pater who had temporarily manumitted him. These situations remained only dormant as long as the new potestas of the mancipio accipiens, the pater who received the son of another pater in causa mancipi, lasted. The son could always be freed from this condition of dependence in forms not unlike those applied for the enfranchisement of slaves, while continuing to burden on him traces of this previous temporarily degradation. Also subjected in a condition not unlike the persona in causa mancipi was the filius who caused damage to another family group, with the consequence that his pater had noxe deditus him to the other pater that had received the damage. It's something similar what we have seen for the slaves. These were not the only semi-servile conditions in which a free man could fall. If the economic condition required it, the same pater could submit to a bond of subordination to another pater. The ancient sources speak of nexus in this regard, where there is clearly the idea of a bond. All these intermediate situations, and so also the nexum, were to be realized through the mancipatio. The effect of this common employment of the mancipatio is that in some very ancient sources, the comedian Plautus, for example, nexum and mancipium seem to merge together. Nexum mancipiumque. So much so as to seem equivalent. But the bond deriving from a nexum was particular, since it does not seem to have generated a slave condition. Rather, it was a personal bond that was created, directly linked to the receipt of a loan to be repaid. On the legal nature of these uncertain situations, neither free nor slaves, on the possible differences between them, we know very little. We must anyway also add another category, the addicti. It means insolvent debtors who, following a forced execution, lost their citizenship and freedom and were in a particular condition analogous to slavery, although not coinciding with it. What we can affirm is that these legal figures were already in a process of dissolution even before the first steps of Roman legal science in proper sense. During the 3rd century before Christ, these figures had almost disappeared or had at least changed their meaning. But they for sure constituted the base of a fundamental experience for the legal institutions in the next period of the Roman Republic. This process determined the borders of a new legal experience. The belonging of a freeman to a community of citizens created an insurmountable space, welding up to its latest developments the idea of citizenship and that of freedom. The legal figures we have just outlined were already in a phase of dissolution under the weight of the great transformation of the 4th century. The Lex Licinia, de Re Alieno, approved in 367 before Christ, determined the diminution of the debts burdening the weaker part of the Roman society, so reducing the process of semi-enslavement that we just analyzed. But the very turning point was constituted by the Lex Paetelia Papiria de Nexis in 326 before Christ, which forbade the personal enslavement of the debtors. After this lex was approved, there was, according to our sources, a new beginning of freedom for the Romans. Since then, it had been difficult to imagine an exploitation of the debtors' workforce self-constrained to creditor through the particular use of the nexum mancipatio. We must not forget, moreover, what effort the Roman military structure was subjected to in these years in which this law was voted, at perhaps the most bitter moment in the struggles for the conquest of central Italy, the so-called Samnitic Wars. It's then understandable that during the maximum military effort, when the need for new soldiers was greater, the Romans decided to limit or suppress the erosion processes of the city staff represented by the enslavement for debts. And on the other hand, what was the use of so many wars fought and so many victories if the labor force that Rome needed was not obtained from them? Hence the growth of the servile mass, which continued through the whole 3rd century. It's only because of a persistent primitivistic orientation, borrowed from a precise ideological representation of the ancient authors, that modern scholars had continued to believe in the existence of this vast reservoir of agricultural labor power ensured by archaic forms of dependency. And not only for the 3rd century, but even for the next 2 centuries, until the civil wars that marked the end on the Roman Republic. This reconstruction, typical of the Marxistic generation, so this idea of archaic forms of dependencies, depended on the overestimation of the archaic system of patronage, whose actual economic significance we know very little. The Marxistic generation of scholars tried to do a comparison between this system of patronage and the capitalistic system, but it doesn't run, as it's not a solution for our problems. And the tendency, and so the Marxistic generation of scholars overestimated this archaic system of patronage and had a tendency to project the massive use of subservient debtors in the Roman countryside even beyond the 3rd century. But, as the Italian distinguished scholar Luigi Capogrossi Colognesi pointed out, since the end of the 4th century before Christ, with the capitalization of the Roman bond system and the obsolescence of the nexum, Roman agrarian system developed other sources of dependent work in the Roman countryside. The effects of this development can be seen in works of ancient authors such as Varro, Columella, and above all, Cato. So much so that historiography has elaborated the notion of Catonian villa as agricultural production unit based on slave labor. The context that we have been describing as results in the evolution of the dictionary of dependencies we are broadly trying to trace. When the Roman jurists during the empire intend to describe the rights of the master over slaves, they use the term dominium. But the term dominium appears in ancient sources only belatedly in legal texts of the late 1st century before Christ. It's no wonder that the full overcoming of the more uncertain forms which characterize the previous linguistic uses, which has already been discussed, is registered only towards the end of the Republican age. In fact, is the result of a long process that characterized in the Latin language the difficult conquest of the abstract notions. The term dominus is instead more anciently attested already in the middle of the 3rd century, but if it also indicated the owner of some goods, it still had a wider semantic dimension. Associated with the domus, from which it clearly derived, it was primarily to designate the lord of the banquet, therefore also the landlord, but first of all the lord of a banquet. On the other hand, the owner, or at least the lord of animated beings, was originally referred to as herus. A strong indication in this sense lies in a fragment of the jurist Ulpianus, who commented on a law of 286 before Christ, the Lex Aquilia de Damno. The action deriving by Lex Aquilia is according to herus, that is the dominus. This hint could perhaps appear too vague to the non-specialist scholar if it were not strengthened by a block of testimonies of particular relevance. I refer to the rich set of linguistic uses attested in the comedies of Plautus and Terentius. In these comedies, whose plots are generally built on the slave-master relationship, there is a statistically very significant number of testimonies, which allows us to reach some fairly sure conclusions. In other words, we are dealing with a rather large number of occurrences of both terms, herus and dominus, in the text of the two comedians. Only that the two terms are divided variously into the current use and language on the servile and free main characters, as well as in relation to the various dependency relationships to which they may refer. And above all, their use shows significant variations from Plautus to Terentius. It could be useful to remember that Plautus died in 184 before Christ, while Terentius was born around 190, so it was the other generation, and died around the middle of the 2nd century. From these variations, therefore, a trend line clearly emerges. In the passage from Plautus to Terentius, it shows the growth in the use of the term dominus instead of herus. In Plautus, we have about 368 cases in which herus appears. Dominus occurs only in 41 cases, so in a ratio of 9:1. If we take into account the slightly older formulation of the Lex Aquilia, we can suspect that we are facing an innovation in full development. Also because in Plautus, dominus occurs 41 times, but sometimes means lord of the banquet, so not lord of the master of slaves. This trend is confirmed by the fact that after Terentius, the use of the term herus will end, except in poetic language and in a non-literary language, mainly as a servile language, attested in some funerary inscriptions. But there is an even more relevant aspect. In Plautus and Terentius, it's possible to detect a no less significant diversity of uses. In Plautus, free men use both terms, however referring herus to the slave master only, and instead referring dominus to both the slave master and that of any other object. This term, in 21 cases, indicates the master of slaves, while in 19 others it's used to indicate the master of other objects. Furthermore, the use of dominus as owner of a slave is much more frequent by them than in the language of slaves, 13 cases against 8. On the contrary, in the language of slaves, the term herus remains largely prevalent, which is also the only term used to designate the owner of slaves, while dominus is used by slaves only to indicate the owner of other objects. So not owner of slaves, master of slaves, but owner of the other objects. Herus, always referred to the master of slave, is used only 58 times by free men against 310 cases in which it occurs in the speech of slaves, in a ratio about 1 to 7. This underlines the strong preference of the latter to limit herus to the specific relationship with owner and master. Beyond any doubt and any possible randomness, in Plautus it seems to be detected a tension between free men and slaves. In fact, free men qualify themselves as domini of all kinds of goods, including, this is the point, also slaves. It's quite possible that this latter use was absolutely recent and still not entirely univocal, since it was also massive, even among the freemen, the use of herus. However, it's relevant enough, above all, to try to understand the ongoing evolutionary process of slavery in the Roman society, that still in Plautus, herus and not dominus was the prevailing term to indicate slave masters, even in the language of the freemen. But it's here, in fact, that a real change in the use of the two terms seems to intervene between Plautus and Terentius, because with Terentius, herus has practically disappeared from the language of the freemen, who, in indicating the master of slaves, now use only dominus. On the other hand, slaves, and only them now, continue to use herus to indicate their relationship with the master. In Terentius, the term herus is attested 52 times. Obviously, the point of view of the master was destined to prevail in the Roman society, and with Cato, Varro, Columella, all of them authors that dealt with slaves constantly in their description of the Roman agriculture, in all these authors, herus didn't exist anymore, just as the term mancipium, that was definitely replaced by servus. But what then can we get from this story? It is a story that was about to an end. First and foremost, it was a transformation in progress, since the rapid expansion of the term dominus in the language of the freemen and the resistance itself in the language of slaves to qualify as dominus the master and owner of slaves and also of other goods highlights, first of all, a linguistic need to bring the slave-master relationship fully and completely within the semantic field of property. But not only that. The stakes were, most likely, the reduction and disappearance of the ambiguity margins of the previous age, where, in relationship between slave and master, a role was also played not only by the barely legal aspects, but also by the echo of personal bonds. Personal bonds in which loyalty and obedience mingled with this sense of belonging to a patriarchal house. The resistance of herus in the servile language is the sign of a resistance to the process of definitive reification and consequent dehumanization of the bondage relationship. For that matter, even if it does not have the continuation of the Latin of the 2nd or 1st century before Christ, of an equally rich testimony such as that of Terentius and Plautus about the servile language, it can be assumed also in the light of the most recent data that this resistance has continued within the servile world. This glimpse, opened by a particular linguistic use, confirms how the consistent growth of an agrarian property of significant dimensions during the whole 3rd century before Christ determined the demand for a large-scale employment of servile labor. It is therefore legitimate to backdate the beginnings of this process, widely debated by modern historians, in which the widespread and the large-scale use of slave labor assumed a decisive value in the Roman society. Especially in the studies of the Roman agricultural history, the entire development of the great agricultural property of the Roman nobilitas was closely associated with the exploitation of vast masses of slaves. This is confirmed by the data of the archaeological research conducted on the Catonian villas excavated in central Italy during the last century, a fact which fully confirms the intuition of Max Weber. There, at the beginning of this line of studies, in 1905, with his Römische Agrargeschichte, associated the new Roman agrarian developments with the wide availability of vast servile masses coming from the victorious wars conducted by Rome. The long-lasting effects of this process are, on the other hand, traceable in the fragments of the Roman jurists. At the beginning of this paper, I shortly quoted the summa divisio, main distinctions, between freemen and slaves introduced by the jurist Gaius. I'd like to read with you some texts where we find a strong internal coherence. The plurality of conditions of asymmetrical dependencies of the archaic phase dissolved in favor of a new and more effective simplification on which the slavery base of Roman society was finally undisputable. The principal division, wrote Gaius, of the use of person is the following: that all men are either free or slaves. Again, men who are free are either freeborn or freedmen. Another jurist, Florentinus, who wrote one generation after Gaius, also tried to do a systematic in his book of institutions, so a manual and handbook for students, about the distinction between liberty, freedom, and slavery. Freedom is the natural power of doing whatever anyone wishes to do unless he is prevented in some way, by force or by law. Slavery is an institution of the jus gentium. Jus gentium is a kind of international law, not written but nature international law, but is another history. So slavery is an institution of the jus gentium by means of which anyone may subject one man to the control of another, contrary to the nature. Slaves are so called for the reason that military commanders were accustomed to sell their captives, and in this manner to preserve them. Then please, preserve is translation for servare, and in Latin maybe you can see the similarity between the two expressions, servi, servare. This is an interesting definition who bring us back to a period after the Lex Petelia Papiria, so the period in which Rome began to conquer its slaves through wars. But it's interesting because we have also a surviving expression, mancipia. As I told you, mancipia was the original term for slaves, but it's interesting because Florentinus has no idea what we can reconstruct using other sources, and he tried to give a definition of mancipia, but also trying to find a solution who connects this kind of slaves with the right of war, of the war rights. They are styled mancipia because they are taken by the hands of their enemies. But it doesn't run. Anyway, this distinction is here organized in a system with the fruit of a systematization done by the jurists. And also here we can read the Marchand, who wrote in the 3rd century, one condition is common to all slaves, but of persons who are free, some are born such and others are manumitted. This is only a small quotation of the same systematic, but it's interesting because this systematic had also some models in not juridical sources. For example, Varro, it's not in your handout. Varro was an author who wrote a history of agriculture in Rome, and he gives a definition of the servi, of the slaves, as instrumentum vocale. So instrumentum vocale is vocal instrument, and also in this case we have something which is very, very far from what we have seen for the archaic period. So the perception that a not jurist as Varro had is that the slave was a res, an object, but an object was able to speak. But it was really so. And now I go to the end of this paper. So, in this text we have read, it's clear the extent of the power of the masters over their slaves. An absolute power, precisely, or life or death, analogous to that which they have over any other property, and which extended precisely to the destruction of the object itself. And this would have induced an author like Varro to qualify the slave as a vocal instrument. But this so clear elaboration, liberi versus servi, developed at the end of the Republican age, but was destined not to last too much. First of all, the dominus could grant freedom to the slave at any time, allowing him to become a libertus, as we can see here, for example, and to enjoy, albeit with some restrictions, the privileges granted to each free citizen. But above all, in the era in which jurists finally wrote, between the 2nd and the 3rd century Anno Domini, slaves had an ability to act in the juridical economic sphere, even if in the name and on behalf of their masters. Therefore, describing the slaves, Gaius, again our Gaius, adds something that would ill adapt to the current system of properties owned by a dominus. Quodcunque per servum adquiritur, id domino adquiritur. Whatever property is acquired by a slave is acquired by his master. This is, without any doubt, an advantage for the master, but an advantage that presupposes, in turn, of the recognition of the peculiarity of the slave compared to other objects owned, and which finally reattributes to him that humanity that makes it something more and different than a simple instrumentum vocale. Because it is an intelligent tool, conscious of its actions and predisposed to a very wide range of uses, also in management of other properties of its master. A range of possibilities that open our view on another range of terms and then on other profiles of slavery semantics. But I've abused your patience too much, and so maybe it will be the theme for another paper. Thank you very much.